Have you ever stopped to think how many people you trust simply because they look normal? The neighbor you pass in the hallway, the coworker who keeps his head down and says good morning, the familiar face that never raises a red flag. Now ask yourself this: what if the most dangerous person in your life is the one who gives you no reason at all to be afraid? If you had walked past him in the apartment corridor, you wouldn't have crossed the street. If you had sat next to him at work, your body wouldn't have reacted. No instinct, no alarm. And that's exactly why Patricia Gomez is no longer alive. Patricia wasn't attacked by someone who looked like a monster. There was no dark alley, no obvious threat, no warning signs that movies train us to expect. She trusted someone who seemed harmless, someone described by neighbors as polite, by coworkers as quiet, reserved, someone people later described with the most dangerous phrase in true crime history: he seemed normal. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people don't want to hear. Men who kill women rarely look like killers. They don't walk around broadcasting danger. They don't announce intent. They blend in. They adapt. They learn how to appear safe. And in many cases, that mask works perfectly, until it doesn't. Female homicide cases follow a disturbing pattern that repeats again and again. The perpetrator isn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. He's someone close enough to observe routines, moods, vulnerabilities. Someone who knows when trust replaces caution. These killers don't rush. They watch. They wait. They rehearse the moment long before it happens, all while maintaining the image of an ordinary man. And when the crime finally comes to light, the reaction is always the same. Friends are shocked. Neighbors are stunned. Co-workers swear they never saw it coming. We never imagined, they say, as if imagination alone could have saved the victim. This is where true crime stops being entertainment and starts being education, because understanding how these predators think, how they camouflage themselves socially, isn't about fear. It's about awareness. It's about recognizing patterns that are invisible unless you know where to look. Tonight, we're not just telling a story. We're stepping inside a mindset most people never want to face. A mindset that hides in plain sight, thrives on trust, and depends on one dangerous assumption: that evil always looks evil. And to understand what really happened to Patricia Gomez, we need to start where everyone else stopped paying attention. Because once you start paying attention, the picture changes. Small details that once felt harmless begin to feel deliberate. The timing of encounters, the way certain questions are asked, the silence that isn't shyness but calculation. In cases like Patricia Gomez's, nothing truly begins on the day of the crime. It begins much earlier, in moments that feel forgettable at the time, and that's what makes them so dangerous. This is why stories like this matter. Not to sensationalize violence, but to slow things down and examine them piece by piece. If, at any point, something in this story reminds you of a person you've known, a situation you've brushed off, or a moment that made you uncomfortable but you couldn't explain why, say it out loud. Leave a comment. These conversations matter. And often it's in the shared patterns that people start recognizing what they missed before. And if you're finding yourself drawn into this kind of analysis, where true crime isn't just about what happened but how and why, take a second to like the video. It tells me this approach is reaching the right people. And if you want to keep learning how predators think, how manipulation hides behind normal behavior, and how these cases connect in ways most channels never explain, subscribing means you'll be here for the next story and the one after that. Because what we're about to break down goes far beyond a single case. What happened to Patricia Gomez follows a psychological pattern that appears again and again, across cities, across decades, across faces that all seem different, but operate in disturbingly similar ways. And to understand how this pattern unfolds, we have to go back to the moment when everything still looked completely normal. Patricia Gomez didn't live a risky life. There was nothing about her routine that would stand out in a police report or a headline. She woke up, went to work, came home, answered messages, paid bills, made plans for later. The kind of ordinary life most people believe keeps them safe. And that belief is exactly where the trap was set. Her mistake wasn't recklessness. It wasn't ignoring danger signs everyone else could see. It was trusting what felt familiar, trusting the idea that normal equals harmless. The person who would later destroy her life didn't appear suddenly, didn't force his way in, didn't announce himself as a threat. He showed up gradually, a greeting here, a short conversation there, a presence that became part of the background. Like furniture you stop noticing because it's always been there. This is how social camouflage works. The aggressor doesn't rush intimacy. He cultivates it. He learns schedules without asking directly. He memorizes patterns disguised as coincidence. He notices when someone is tired, distracted, emotionally open. None of it feels aggressive in the moment. It feels polite. It feels human. It feels safe. In cases like this, danger doesn't come from chaos, but from routine, from repetition, from the slow erosion of distance. The mind lowers its guard because nothing bad has happened yet, and that yet stretches longer every day, until caution feels unnecessary and boundaries soften without anyone realizing it. This kind of criminal doesn't need brute force at the beginning. He needs access. He needs proximity. He needs the illusion of predictability. That's why neighbors remember him as calm. Coworkers recall him as quiet. Acquaintances describe him as forgettable. Being forgettable is an advantage. It allows him to move through spaces without friction, without suspicion, without resistance. By the time the attack happens, the groundwork is already laid. The aggressor isn't improvising. He's acting on a process that's been unfolding silently, guided by observation, entitlement, and a distorted sense of control. What looks sudden from the outside is, in reality, the final step of something that's been building in plain sight. And to understand how that silent process takes shape inside the mind of someone who blends in so well, you have to stop looking at the crime itself and start paying attention to what was happening long before anyone thought there was something to fear. This is where most true crime stories stop short, because opening this part makes people uncomfortable. It's easier to label someone as evil and move on than to examine how ordinary thoughts slowly bend into something dangerous. But if you really want to understand cases like this, you have to look at what was happening inside, long before the crime ever existed as an idea. In the mind of this type of aggressor, control comes first. Not violence, not chaos, but control. He plays scenes in his head where he decides what happens and when. These fantasies don't always involve the final act people imagine. Often they're quieter, being listened to, being obeyed, being important in someone else's world. Trust becomes currency, and once he feels he has it, the sense of power grows. It's subtle, almost invisible from the outside, but internally, it's reinforcing something he feels he lacks. Alongside that fantasy runs a deep, silent resentment. He believes life has overlooked him, that people underestimate him, dismiss him, or owe him something they never gave. But he doesn't argue, doesn't complain, doesn't confront. He stores it. Each perceived slight becomes evidence in a private narrative where he is always wronged and never responsible. This accumulation doesn't release pressure. It sharpens it. The longer it stays unspoken, the more justified it feels. And then there's the mask. Normality isn't accidental. It's learned. He understands that blending in offers protection. Being polite lowers defenses. Being predictable makes others comfortable. He studies social behavior the way others study survival skills. What looks like kindness is often mimicry. What looks like calm is emotional detachment practiced over time. In everyday settings, offices, apartment buildings, neighborhoods, this strategy works disturbingly well. Nothing snaps overnight. There is no single breaking point people can point to later. Everything is built slowly, reinforced by routine, silence, and opportunity. The internal world keeps evolving while the external one stays calm, almost boring. And that imbalance between what's seen and what's hidden is where the real danger forms, quietly shaping the moment when thought begins to feel like permission. When the crime finally happens, what surprises most people is how controlled it is. There is no internal storm, no loss of awareness, no sudden madness taking over. Inside the aggressor, there is focus, a narrow, deliberate attention that shuts out everything except the objective he's been rehearsing in fragments for a long time. This is where the gap between popular myths and psychological reality becomes impossible to ignore. He doesn't experience the moment the way an average person would. The victim is no longer seen as a full human being with fear, history, or agency. She becomes a role inside a fantasy that has already stripped her of complexity. Empathy doesn't disappear in that instant. It was never fully there to begin with. What exists instead is entitlement mixed with justification, a belief that this moment makes sense within his internal narrative. That's why the behavior can feel chillingly efficient. There's no hesitation, no second guessing. The emotional distance he's practiced for years finally serves its purpose. In his mind, this isn't chaos, it's completion, a distorted sense of order being restored, even as destruction unfolds. What happens after is often more disturbing than the act itself. Instead of collapse or panic, many of these individuals attempt to slide back into everyday life. They wake up, go to work, answer messages, follow routines. They expect the mask to keep working, just as it always has. And in many cases it does. People around them see the same quiet coworker, the same polite neighbor, the same unremarkable presence. Normalcy becomes camouflage once again. This return to routine isn't denial, it's confidence. Confidence in the belief that appearances are stronger than truth, that social order protects those who know how to perform it. The absence of visible guilt isn't accidental. It's the result of long-term emotional detachment and cognitive compartmentalization, skills sharpened over time. And as unsettling as it is, this phase reveals something essential. The crime doesn't feel like an ending to him. It feels like a moment that should fit seamlessly into the life he believes he deserves to keep living. Understanding that mindset is crucial because it explains how these patterns persist, how suspicion fades, and how silence continues long after the damage is done, until small inconsistencies begin to surface and the illusion starts to fracture. If you want to understand how these patterns repeat themselves in real-life cases, subscribe to the channel now. Here, we don't report crimes by shock. We explain them so you can protect yourself. When you line up cases like Patricia's side by side, a pattern starts to emerge that feels uncomfortably consistent. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but quiet and repetitive. The same behaviors show up in different cities, different years, different faces. And once you recognize them, they're hard to unsee. One of the most common elements is silent observation. Not curiosity, not casual interest, but sustained attention that goes unnoticed because it isn't intrusive. The person knows when someone leaves, when they return, who they talk to, what their mood usually is. It doesn't look like stalking at first. It looks like awareness. And awareness, in everyday life, doesn't raise alarms. There's also an unusual interest in routine. Questions that seem harmless, comments that sound friendly, small references that suggest familiarity before familiarity was ever earned. This isn't social bonding, it's data collection, information gathered slowly, stored mentally, and used to predict behavior. Predictability creates opportunity. Another repeating signal is passivity taken to an extreme. The individual rarely asserts himself openly. He avoids conflict. He blends into the background. People describe him as shy, awkward, or simply forgettable. That invisibility becomes a shield. It lowers expectations and keeps suspicion far away, especially in environments where loudness is mistaken for threat. What's missing is just as important as what's present: real empathy. Instead, there's imitation. He knows what concern is supposed to look like, how sympathy is supposed to sound, but it doesn't translate into genuine emotional connection. Relationships stay shallow by design. Trust is built without vulnerability, without mutual exposure, without emotional risk on his side. And this is where the collective mistake happens. We're taught to look for danger that announces itself: raised voices, aggressive behavior, obvious instability. But the most damaging figures don't announce anything. They whisper through consistency, politeness, and time. They rely on the assumption that threat must be loud to be real. Once you understand that, the question stops being why no one noticed and becomes how often these signs are dismissed as harmless. Because the moment you start paying attention to what repeats quietly, you begin to see how these patterns position themselves long before anyone realizes what they're standing next to. The most dangerous offender is rarely the one who looks dangerous. He survives on hesitation, on politeness, on the benefit of the doubt. He knows people don't want to be wrong about someone who seems decent, helpful, ordinary. And that hesitation buys him time. Time to observe, time to adapt, time to move closer, without resistance. Patricia didn't die because she lacked intelligence or awareness. She died because modern life trains us to trust appearances, to reward calm behavior, to interpret silence as safety. We're taught that threat announces itself, that danger is loud, unstable, obvious. But real harm often comes wrapped in normal routines, familiar faces, and social comfort. Understanding how these minds work isn't about fear or obsession. It's about pattern recognition. It's about emotional literacy in a world where manipulation often hides behind courtesy. Psychology, behavioral science, and victimology all point to the same uncomfortable reality. The signals are there, but they don't look like warnings unless you know how to read them. That's why this kind of analysis matters beyond any single case. It connects personal safety to critical thinking, intuition to evidence, everyday interactions to deeper behavioral trends. When you stop expecting danger to look dramatic, you start noticing the quiet inconsistencies, the absence of empathy, the imbalance in trust, the comfort taken without being earned. The truth is, real threat doesn't feel threatening at first. It feels familiar, predictable, even boring, and that's what allows it to move undetected through communities, workplaces, and relationships. Once that idea settles in, the story of Patricia Gomez stops being isolated and begins to resemble something broader, something repeated, something that only becomes visible when you shift your attention from the surface to what's happening underneath. If you've stayed this far, it's because this type of conversation resonates with you, not because of shock value, but because of understanding. So if this deeper look at behavior, patterns, and criminal psychology helps you see the world more clearly, subscribing to the channel is just a way to continue this exchange. The next videos follow exactly this line: less sensationalism, more reading of signs that normally go unnoticed. If you want, leave a comment with the phrase "I made it to the end," not as a ritual, but so I know that this type of analysis is reaching those who really want to understand, not just watch. And if at any point you felt that silent connection, when something clicks and makes sense, a like helps the video reach other people who also need to learn to read these patterns before it's too late. There's a video here that complements this topic and further deepens this logic behind real cases. Click there and continue with me there.